Hello, everyone. So this is our Group Three's final presentation, and what we've done is our presentation is about communication in a broad sense, but more specifically, it's more of a timeline about the development of communication and how that has impacted the development of humanity as a whole. Right? So we start off with a definition of communication. I'm sure you guys already know this. So basically, it has two forms, right? A verb form, so the imparting slash exchanging of information or news, and then it can be a descriptor in terms of written communication, verbal communication, etc. So I think before we move on to the timeline, which I touched on earlier, it's important to look at where we're at right now in terms of communication in our society to just understand as we're going through the timeline how exactly we got to this point, right? So obviously, communication is extremely prevalent today with the internet and computers in everyone's front pocket. We actually live in what's called the information age, and that's named after the ease of, you know, accessing information and communicating with each other. So if we think about this nomenclature for a minute, the information age, right? If we go back and look at different periods in history, we name them after the tools which helped humanity develop beyond that point in history, right? So we have the Iron Age, right? What is that known for? Iron tools, or the Age of Discovery. What is that? When people were spurred to explore the new world, which obviously helped propel humanity forward. So I think it says a lot that the period we're living in right now is the information age when you look at that historical trend. So the first thing we're going to talk about is voice, right? And voice is different from language in a way, right? Because when you look at how voice was originally used, it was able to communicate things without the advent of language, right? So, I mean, you look at any social creature in the animal kingdom, and they use their voice to communicate in a way. Obviously, humanity did that at some point as well, right? So, before spoken language developed, early humans still used their voice to express feelings of joy, fear, and discomfort, similar to other modern day primates. But then obviously we developed spoken language, right? And spoken language developed before written language. So the origin of spoken language is actually fiercely debated and really murky. I mean, we just simply do not know where it came from. So, as we're going to get into later, it's very important that we're able to record ourselves with things like the written language and paper and things like that, because anything in the history of our species that was discovered during the age of voice and spoken language and wasn't written down, that knowledge is lost to us, right? So this is the most basic form of communication and the most basic developmental stage of our species is voice communication. We move on to writing, right? So I'm just going to read through this slide. The history of writing traces the development of expressing the language by letters, pictures, or other marks. Glyphs directly represent objects and concepts and slowly evolve into some fonts such as Chinese characters and letters we now use. The development process of writing can be simply divided into the following stages, and we have those here. After the invention of writing, people's communication became convenient and it was easy to record, and that's the key, right? After the invention of paper, the combination of writing and writing materials made our communication methods more effective. Put that away. So, as I said earlier, the main thing about writing is it gives a sense of permanency to our communications. So let's say that we're two early humans and we're walking around and we find a huge source of food, right? But our village is doing okay, so we want to leave it there and store it for later. So we go back to our village and tell them all about this food and where it's at. And then we end up dying of some disease. And then 3 months later, our village is starving and they need to go get that food. Well, guess what? Before we could write things down, if they didn't remember exactly what we said through spoken language, that information was lost. So that's the first big developmental milestone is the fact that we could give a sense of permanency to the information that we have and communicate that to other members of our species. So then we have the postal system, right? And I think it's important to state that the postal system predates the invention of paper, right? So as we talked about in this class, paper really helped with uh, pushing, lots of different sources of the same information out there, or high volume communication relative for that time period, right? The postal system is more about breadth and distance, right? Before we could mass produce information like we could with paper and the printing press, We wanted to get information further than our eyes could see and our ears could hear, right? So that's where the postal system comes in. The institution that makes it possible for any person to send a letter, packet, or parcel to any addressee in the same country or abroad. In the ancient world, many civilizations, including Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Rome, and China, had efficient postal systems to deliver messages to parts of their empires, primarily relying on horses. The current postal system is very efficient and ubiquitous, whether it's international courier or courier service in the same city. From the early single route to the current postal system in any corner of the world, the entire world is connected by the postal system. It makes a connection between people quick and convenient. Which brings us to paper, right? And there's really not much that needs to be said to this audience about paper because that's what this whole class is about. So I'll just give you a minute to go ahead and look over this. And as I said earlier, what makes paper so great is that we can send the same information out on multiple pieces of paper to multiple people at one time, right? So this is where we really start to see society and humanity develop to an advanced point, right? Where we can push information to multiple different people all at one time instead of using stone tablets where, unless someone had access to a postal system, they probably weren't going to get a hold of that information, right? But with the combination of the postal system and paper, we were able to spread information much more rapidly, much more efficiently, which, as our presentation argues, is one of the main things which spurred the development of humankind. Also, another thing to look at is with paper, we were able to really effectively document ourselves and our history as a species, right? Which I think is a huge developmental milestone. And what makes paper out of all these probably the most important from a developmental standpoint. Because once paper was invented and became proliferated, you could almost say that's the point where humanity became self-aware, right? We started to really document ourselves so we could learn from our mistakes and know our history. I think that's just a really important thing to consider when we talk about different methods of communication developing and the development of our species coinciding. So that brings us to the beginnings of electronic communication. And I think what's interesting about this is that, okay, obviously electronic communication is a process by which electricity augments how we communicate. I think these three inventions, the telegraph, the fax machine, and the telephone, are what really set the stage and created this attitude of now. Like, I want instant information. Give it to me now across any distance. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, that's just the norm today. But this is probably like the primordial, beginnings of where that attitude, give me information now, really came from, was with these three inventions and the advent of electronic communication. So there are tons of famous faxes and telegrams and whatnot. I think a really cool one to look at is this one. It's tell Oob to get back to work on the mouse fast, or to get to work on the mouse fast. So this was actually a telegram sent after Walt Disney lost the rights to his original cartoon Oswald. He sent this telegram to his brother Roy, and then they instructed their animator, Oob, I guess, to get to work on the mouse, which obviously turns out to be Mickey. So when we look back at how these different forms of communication have helped humanity become more complicated and have created massive changes in our culture, I think this is a perfect example. Because if Walt Disney wasn't able to send that communication and, be able to send that information instantly and across a really large area of land, we might not see the Walt Disney Corporation as we know it today. And that's a really big deal because, I mean, think about how much Disney has affected our global culture and our culture as a species. I mean, just thinking about things like that, I think is really important to realize just how critical our means of communication is for the development of our species and for our culture. So then we get into 21st century communication. And as we all know, this is where things get a little weird, right? So communication in the 21st century has been dominated by computers and the internet. Email and social media have made it possible to communicate one message with massive amounts of people instantaneously, far beyond what, people using paper could ever dream of. And with I think with the massive amounts of information being disseminated constantly like a fire hose on the internet is where we really see the development of internet culture. And it has a big streak of absurdism in it, as I'm sure many of you know, right? And a lot of people attribute that to different memes that have started. And I think as we talked about earlier, it's very important for us as a species to document our history, which started with paper. But I think internet culture is going to play a much larger role in that than we realize today. And the reason I say that is because, as many historians will tell you, things like jokes or memes, etc., were very rarely consciously recorded. Right? Any joke or inside reference in the past, especially like through ancient history, was often due to like happenstance, like it just happened to be recorded. But now, literally every joke, every inside joke, every meme, quote unquote, is being recorded through the internet. And I think that's going to be a great window into our culture for those looking back 200, 300, 1,000 years from now. I don't know, just something I think about sometimes. And then another thing we see is a very fervent debate as to whether this ease of communication through the internet has made humanity more isolated and more connected. And this is something I wanted to touch on a little bit because I also think this really speaks to the development of our species, coinciding with the development of our means of communication, right? So if we really think about it, through the internet and through things like social media, humanity has kind of become a bit of a hive mind, right? We all kind of have a bit of a shared consciousness through the internet. Like there's a lot of shared information that we all have in our brains if we have access to internet connection. So I think that's where the increased connectedness comes from. But at the same time, that really goes in the face of individualism, right? The fact that we're sort of becoming like more as one and more of a bit of a hive through the internet, I think that really creates a sense of despair, especially in places like the United States where individualism is such a strong part of our culture. So I guess it really just depends on your perspective, whether as to not we're more connected or more isolated due to this form of communication. And then obviously information is much more readily available. And, uh, you know, a great example is the fact that we're continuing to go to classes during this global pandemic. So some takeaways, the complexity of human society is directly correlated with the complexity of communication methods at our disposal. The advancement of communication is directly responsible for many aspects of human culture. Increased connectedness can be a double-edged sword, as we just mentioned previously, and communication will continue to develop and improve until the end of our species. So a good question to think about is, what will communication look like in the future? And as we see here, so far people's communication methods have become more convenient, more diverse, and more high-end. From telegraph to phone, snail mail, email, from text to emoticon, laughing face. Uh, Innovation in human contact makes it possible to communicate information faster, cheaper, and more clearly. And then here we have some, speculations about, we can implant chips in the human body or brain and communicate through brain waves. And I mean, that might sound crazy, but I really think that it's so hard to predict how communication is going to change in the future. Even for someone 50 to 100 years ago, to ask them to try and predict how ridiculously advanced and complicated our means of communication has become through the internet, I think that just speaks to how, humanity develops exponentially rather than linearly, right? The level of advancement that communication has taken in the past 100 years compared to the last 1,000 before that is insane. So really, who's to say what communication will look like in the future? It's very hard to predict, and I think it's a question that you should ponder if you really want to rack your brain. And then, of course, we're going to stick to some forms of traditionalism as well in terms of writing with a paper and pen, right? We still do that very commonly. So I think that it's important to stay to our roots, because there may be a future where electricity maybe isn't feasible for us as a species anymore, and we have to use paper and pen again. So I think that it's good to have many different forms of communication in our lexicon, and I mean, I call it a lexicon, but maybe a better term would be repertoire, and that overall is advantageous for our species. So that's the end of our presentation. I had to really fly through it because this free screen recorder only lets us do 15 minutes of recording. So if you guys have any questions, I'm sure we could get those answered, and have a great day.